Thank you very much for this kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here among you, and for the first time I've been visiting New Zealand, and since this morning, since yesterday I've been in Wellington. So I will not give, I'm not coming here to give advice on your city or even on New Zealand. I try if I can to avoid speaking about things I do not know. It's not always easy. But I hope that the experience of other cities in the world will be relevant to you. The cities are very idiosyncratic, and I don't believe that what works in one city could necessarily work in another one. You have always to adapt to local conditions. That leads me to the theme of my talk, which is market and design, and one of the outcomes of this dialectic between the market and design is housing affordability. This is a practical outcome. So in a certain way, when I discuss market and design, these things are a little theoretical, but do not forget that the outcome is very practical. The recent survey on housing affordability, which is worldwide, although it's concentrated only on English-speaking countries, demographia, put the housing price, of the housing affordability in New Zealand at a very high level. It's measure, really simple measure of the multiple of income, the price of housing compared to the median income, and it come at 8. Where normally, let's say, housing is considered affordable when this ratio is below 3. So it's extraordinarily high in New Zealand, and I was all the more surprised to learn about it because normally this high price for housing is linked to a shortage of land in country where which are either very dense, like Holland, for instance, or Bangladesh at another spectrum, or which are limited by nature, like Hong Kong, for instance, or even Singapore, are limited in supply. Now, if you look at the map of New Zealand and you look at the overall density of New Zealand, this is not a problem. You have plenty of land. To reassure you, I will tell you that whenever I travel and arrive in a new city, and if I have a meeting with a mayor, wherever it is, the mayor always say, this problem, this city has this very special problem that do not happen in other countries. We have a shortage of land. And if you look at the map again, like if I look at New Zealand, I don't see any shortage of land. There was only one city where I saw a real shortage of land, and I knew what they meant. It's the capital of the Maldives island. The capital of the Maldives is a little, it's a circular island, which is about 1.2 kilometers in diameter, and it's fully built. And around that is the Indian Ocean. So I say, yes, here you have a shortage of land. and the question whether up or out, like this recent very good report of here, is not a question. It's certainly up because there is no out. But so let us get to this issue of market and design. When I say design, I'm not talking about the design of an architect for individual building. This is absolutely legitimate and necessary, but it is also the source of confusion. Many planners, like myself, have a background either in architecture or in engineering. And if you are an architect or an engineer, before you build anything, you need to design it in detail. And the more detailed is the design, the better is the outcome usually. You don't have, if you build an apartment building, you don't have the plumbing at the last minute. So it's very important to start designing in details. When I studied architecture and planning at the same time, it was considered that it was about the same scale. It's just that working in cities, we're just working at a much larger scale, but it was a design skill that you had, and the more detailed were your plan, the better they were supposed to be. This is an enormous confusion. And I think we are still paying the price for it right now. A city is a living organism which cannot be designed in advance. You can project, you can make projection about the growth of the city, you can project how much water the city will consume in 20 years, but it's only a projection. You don't really know. And the shape of the city itself cannot be really designed because there are a lot of information that you don't have. When you design an apartment building or a bridge, you have a client, and you have one client, and this client gives you all the data you need to design it. For instance, say if you build a bridge, you will have this, you will have the amount of traffic will go through this bridge, you will have the load, you will have the span, you will have the geology where the bridge will stand. You have all this data. So if you have all this data, you can indeed design a bridge which might even call optimum. Other engineers will look at the design and say, yes, this is a good bridge. You cannot do that for cities because you do not have a client. You do not know your client. Your client are households and firms who have decided to move to this city for the household because they can find a good job and they find it pleasant, and for the firm because they can find the labor they need and access to the material they want. So basically, a city, the raison d'etre of a city is a large labor market. The larger is a labor market, the more efficient is a city if this labor market works well in terms of transport and housing affordability. Again, the benefit of being a little old is that you see how ideas have evolved over a long time. I mean, not that long, but still. In the 60s, there were a lot of work about the optimum size of cities. And for instance, a city like Brasilia, which was planned in the 50s and 60s, was supposed to be no more than 500,000 people. Now, retrospectively, imagine the capital of a city like Brazil being limited to 500,000 people. It's extremely naive. Now, the people who thought that were not stupid. They just, had the wrong image of what is a city. So, the city, really, the raison d'etre of city is economics. A lot of my colleagues are really shocked when I say that the city is a labor market. This is a reductionism. A city for all of us is much more than that. It's friend work there. It's meeting people, going to concerts, going to the opera, having a good restaurant. All these things are what makes cities attractive. However, all these things can function only if the labor market works well. What is the labor market? It's assumed that within a city, a metropolitan area, people are able to move from one side of the city to another in less than an hour. That they can select any job they prefer. That they are able to change jobs if they find that the job corresponds more to their skill and make them, more efficient or their job more enjoyable. For the firm who move to a city, what is important for them is to find among the people who live in a city the skill that they require. And these skills, by the way, may change with time. It might be when they move first, they require a type of skill, but as their business develops, they require another one. I will give you an example. For instance, you have somebody who is in the food business and is exporting first, say, to Australia, food. I don't know if this is done here, but probably it is. Suddenly the business increase, and they find that they have a market in Europe. Now this firm will need to use the skill of somebody who knows all the regulation of Europe concerning food and the different importation. This is a very rare skill, and you will not find that in a little town. You will find that in, if you have a large labor market. You may also share the skill of this person with another firm, probably. So this is really the foundation of cities. All that means that, in fact, you cannot plan a city the way you plan a factory or an office building, where you have functionality which are well established. The director will be there, accounting department will be there, and you can plan everything like that. In a city, you cannot plan that. However, we see that still now, a lot of planners try to create an order within cities which reflects, in a way, a building, but it's only their concept of the way a city works. It is not the way the city works, really. So, to be a little less abstract now, I will start with markets and the way markets influence cities, and I will start with something relatively simple, which is densities. Normally planners have ideas about densities. They will tell you, I think this city is not dense enough, or they will say, I think this city is too dense, or this part is too dense, this is not dense enough. Densities is basically consumption. It's a consumption of land per person or per job. As you know, consumption is really decided by the market. The amount of thing you consume depends on your income, and so supply and demand. It doesn't depend on design. You cannot decide. Everybody will have an apartment of 150 square meters. This makes no sense at all, and we all know. So let us look at this density. I have here a chart where I have ranked cities by densities. At the top, I have the lowest densities, and at the bottom, the highest. And each time, it's a city or a metropolitan area, and I have about 60 metropolitan areas there. The way they are distributed worldwide is not a random selection. It's very idiosyncratic. It's cities where I've worked. With one exception, I have added Auckland. I will show you where Auckland stands there, where I've never worked and I don't know at all. But before we came here, my wife measured the density of Auckland the way we measure other densities. Again, densities is a number, but there are 20 different ways of measuring densities. And unless you measure the density exactly the same way for every city, you get completely different results. So these are built-up density. That means that basically we measure the built-up area of a city, and then we go back to census tract, and we overlap the two, and then we calculate what is the density in the built-up area. That means if you have a park of more than 4 hectares, this will not be counted in the built-up. For instance, say New York Central Park is not counted in the built-up. If you have an airport, we do not count it in the build-up. So this is in order to have, again, a comparable data. So let us look at this. I have also divided the city by continent, because I believe that densities reflect markets, and markets reflect culture. Now, it's a little ambitious to say that within, say, the Asian continent, you have one culture. Certainly not. Between let's say, Bangladesh or China, you have certainly very different culture. However, look at my chart here. So in red here, I have North American cities. In yellow, I have European cities, and in green, Latin American city, and purple, African cities. You see that there is a clustering of city by continent. let us look also at the, I don't think you are able to read the number from where you are, but I will read them for you. At the top, in my collection of city, I have Atlanta with an average density in the built-up area of 6 people per hectare. This is extremely low. Many areas in rural area in China have a density much higher than that, but they are not cities because people, they are not a large labor market. People do not communicate with each other. They are staying in. So you have 6 people per hectare at one extreme. At the other extreme, I have Mumbai with 400 people per hectare. You see this enormous range of density between one to another. So you could say that those cities are in fact very different animals. What work in one city, at 6 people per hectare will not work in a city of 400 people per hectare. So we have to take that into account also, that every city has its own, but this density will determine a lot of the things which can be done in the city. I will give you a range. So now Auckland, as I had no city in your region, I added to Asia. I added Asia and Pacific. Pacific is just for Auckland. So Auckland, you see, it's this blue bar here with 28 people per hectare, and it is a little slightly lower than the lower density in Europe that I have collected, which is Stockholm, which is interesting because Stockholm also has exactly the same population as Auckland, 1.4 million, and it has also a water constraint like Auckland, a lot of lakes and also the sea penetrating. So Auckland has about the same density as one of the lowest density in Europe, but it's basically a European city in this sense, not an American one. The outlier in the US is, of course, New York, which has a higher density. You see that the range of density even in Europe is rather large, from Stockholm 36 to Moscow 182, or let's discount Moscow because it fits past, but say Barcelona with 170 people per hectare. Again here, between Stockholm and Barcelona, we are talking about 2 different animals. What work in Barcelona, for instance, this extensive metro, 60% of the people getting to work using a subway, is completely irrelevant to Stockholm. It's different. So again here, what I want to show here is that those densities have not been created by urban planner. I've worked in all the cities. No planner has said, our goal is 200 people per hectare or something like that. No, it has been decided by market. Some cities are very affluent, like Hong Kong or Seoul here, which are very dense. Some are rather poor, like Lahore here, or Kabul here, and they are next to each other in density. There is no correlation between income and density. There is no correlation between economic efficiency and density. So this is purely idiosyncratic for each city, but it means also that experience cannot be necessarily translated if you go from one extreme to another, because those density decide a lot of things. I have another graph here. Which on this graph I represent only 12 cities, but I'm representing the way densities are distributed within a city. The graph is designed that way. Horizontally here, I have the distance from the city center from 0 to 30 kilometers. All the graphs are exactly at the same scale. And vertically, I represent the densities, and from 0 to 350 people per hectare within each city. I divide the city. When I say I divide, usually my wife has done that most of the time. Sometimes I do too. You divide the city in circles, and you superimpose the data, the built-up area and also the census tract, and you count the number of people which are within the circle for 1 kilometer interval, and you divide this number of people by the area which is actually built up. That means that in the case of Auckland, you will remove, of course, all the water which will fall within one of those circles, or you will remove also the volcanoes or whatever is not built. So you end up here with a profile of density which has a certain pattern and which follows exactly, by the way, the theoretical work that some economists have done and what they call the monocentric model. Although none of those studies are monocentric, the pattern of density follow very much the monocentric model. So it's some, it's a case where the empirical data really reinforce a theoretical construct that economists did, but that urban planners very often ignore. I don't know of any urban planning office where I worked where they had drawn those diagrams, which in fact are. Now, let us look at the city we are looking at now. Vertically here, I have 3 European cities: Paris, Warsaw, Barcelona. 3 Asian cities: Beijing, Jakarta, and Bangkok. 3 North American cities: Atlanta, Los Angeles, and New York. And then 3 Latin American cities: Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires, and Mexico City. Those cities, as you can see, have nothing to do with each other. Their culture, their history, their economy is not based on anything in common. All of them follow this density gradient, with high density in the center, low density in the periphery, which are purely explained by economics. The cost of transport vis-a-vis the income of people. This is what really defines that. So when the cost of transport decreases vis-a-vis the income, the gradient becomes flatter. When it increases, it becomes sharper. But do not forget that at the same time, there is a cultural element in it. The price of transport in Paris is not particularly high, especially the transit is heavily subsidized, so it's relatively low. Why should Paris have such a high, high density in the center? This is due to amenities, and again, an effect of market, but market representing culture. If the level of amenity in a city, in the center city, is very high, like it is in London or Paris or New York, quite a number of people are ready to sacrifice floor space, to consume less floor space, in order to be closer to the center of the city. This is, again, an economic, it's a market phenomenon. The more facilities you have, the more attraction you have in the center, usually the more density it will be. That explains also why Atlanta and Los Angeles have much lower density in the center, is that, I hope nobody in Los Angeles or Atlanta will be offended, but the level of amenities in the center of Atlanta and Los Angeles are not particularly high. And there is not much reason to trade off floor space for, in order to be closer to the center, especially if you have, relatively good income. You can use transport. Now, another aspect is of course the concentration of jobs. Up to about 50 years ago, the CBD, the center of cities, the area which is there within the first 2 or 3 kilometers, usually included more than 50% of the jobs were there. The tendency the last 50 years have been for the jobs to disperse. And even in cities like Paris or London, which have a traditionally extremely strong center, very attractive, you have job dispersal. Planners usually have been unable, of course they didn't plan it, it came from the firm themselves who decided they were better off in suburbs, but planners have been reluctant to to face this reality. And they still very often try to follow the monocentric model, trying to bring people to the center, and where in fact it is not quite the way the city functions. This is the density gradient of Oakland, but I will not interpret it because I know nothing about Oakland. You see that it is relatively flat, it has a high density in the center, but it decreases very quickly, and then it stays about flat. Normally this suggests that the city is bumping into something. It could be a mountain, or it could be an urban growth boundary, which is about the same thing. Seoul, which has a much higher density than that, of course, Seoul city had a bit a profile like that 30 years ago because they had the green belt, and the Koreans are very strict about their regulation, much more than the Brits, by the way, because London also had the green belt, but the green belt is not as effective as the Korean one, and so the city was expanding, bumping into the green belt, and so the density were going up everywhere and becoming rather flat. Of course, the result of that is that you can imagine that the price of housing was very high too, because there was no more supply. There were more people, but less supply. The Korean government, again, I'm talking about 30 years ago, was very upset by those high prices, and they decided that it was speculated. And the last guy was sold a piece of land, was inside the last vacant piece of land inside the green belt. They threw him in jail, saying that it was unfair to charge so much money for land. Of course, throwing the poor guy in jail didn't lower the price of land. And eventually they realized that it might not have been a good system. And we will see later what Seoul has become since. Excuse me. We have said that basically a city is a large labor market. For this labor market to work, you need people to go wherever they have to go during the day and come back home in the evening. I would compare that to the tide. A tide here it's every 8 hours. You have this tide of people leaving their home, going where they have to go to support the city and themselves, and then come back in the evening. The pattern of this tide is very important. You cannot force it in one way or another. It's again decided by the location of household and firms and by densities. So let us look at the pattern which are observed in cities. The first one is what is called the classical monocentric model. The way most cities were about 50 years ago. You have most of the job in the center. People live in the periphery and the center at higher density, and basically you have this radial movement from the periphery to the center. Relatively simple. This is where transit is usually efficient because you have dispersed origin, but you have a concentrated destination, so it's relatively easy to operate transit, especially at rush hour. Then you have the city, the polycentric or dispersed model, which will be more represented like Los Angeles, for instance, so mostly North American cities, some, where the jobs are completely dispersed. Some in clusters, but in Los Angeles, for instance, if you look at the pattern of jobs now, the jobs are practically evenly distributed throughout. So why would firms, by the way, disperse like that? Why don't they stay in the center? If they had stayed in the center, the distance would be shorter, for everybody. Why did they move? Well, they moved because of the land price. A pattern like that implies that everybody is competing for a relatively small amount of land in the center, and therefore the price of land is very high. Now, some firms can pay this price very well. Lawyer firm, for instance, insurance company, banks, department store. Other firms, especially startup, cannot afford this price, and therefore they go in the periphery where they can have a much cheaper land. It's not by chance that Apple or Hewlett-Packard were started in a garage, in a periphery. They could not have started in a downtown area. It would have been impossible, just too expensive. At the same time, Hewlett-Packard and Apple could start in a garage because they had this pattern of circulation. Although they were in the periphery, it was relatively easy with individual transport to reach them. If they had 10 employees, these employees might be coming from other part of the city, but they could commute. So this again represents different stage of city and different pattern. Most cities are in fact like the third graph here. It's a superimposition of the monocentric city with a polycentric city. And so you have a movement which goes to the center but represents less and less jobs. And then you have movement which goes to suburbs. Even in cities which have a very strong center, like New York or Paris, historically, with a lot of amenities, with a lot of things concentrated in the center. In the metropolitan area of Paris or New York, only 30% of the trips are toward or within the center. And I consider the center in an extended sense. I consider the center of New York is the entire island of Manhattan. If I was taking only Wall Street or Midtown, it would be much smaller. So if you consider Manhattan, it's only 30% of the trips. 70% of the trips in New York are from suburb to suburb. A lot of planners found that very hard to swallow. Paris is exactly the same thing. I consider Paris not just the 8th arrondissement where most buildings are, most the business are, but the entire, Paris, historical Paris, the municipality of Paris with 2 million people. And again here, only 30% of the trips are from suburbs to Paris or within Paris. 70% are from suburb to suburb. This, we have to face this reality. In particular, for those 70% of trips which are from suburb to suburbs, transit do not work well as a transport. If you want to maintain a labor market which is fluid, where you commute less than 1 hour per trip, you have to find something else than transit. Transit cannot do it. Now, cars, of course, those cities survive because cars provide this transport. The problem with cars is that they have not been designed for commuting, for urban. They are too bulky. They consume too much energy. A car has been designed to bring your family on a picnic on Sunday, not to go to work every morning. And I think that here there is a challenge. I believe that in the future there will be more and more dispersed jobs. It's an illusion to think that transit could be developed to serve those jobs. If they are dispersed, if origin are dispersed and destination are dispersed, transit cannot do it. Now, transit will still be efficient to serve and absolutely necessary to serve the area of the city which is in the center, which is still very dense. There's still like inside Paris, the density is 200 people per hectare. You cannot have that many cars if you have a density of 200 people per hectare, because a normal car consumes too much real estate for parking, but most of the real estate a car consumes is on the road. A car going at 40 kilometers an hour consumes about 80 square meters of land. And it's very difficult for roads to substitute capital for land. You can do it for an office building. You can have multi-level office buildings, so you use relatively little land and a lot of office space. For cars, as soon as you build an elevated highway, it's extremely expensive. And what is more expensive is not so much to elevate the highway, to have 2 levels, but once those cars are up on this level, you have to get them down at a certain point. And to get them down, if the car has to stay at 40 kilometers an hour, it takes a lot of real estate. And if you are in the center, this is the most expensive real estate. So that's why, in a way, for all the trips which are within the center, you are stuck with a majority of trips which have to be transit. Now, I have here a force model. And this force model, will solve all the problems I've been talking about. It has only one problem, is that it doesn't exist, except in master plan or in the mind of planners. But let us look at, it's important, I always display it, although it's fictional, fictitious, because I would say that in about half of the master plan that I'm called to review, I found this model. So this is where we will go. Basically, planners are saying, we are going to match jobs and people. And so that they will be like living in a little village, and a big city will be made of 20 or 30 little village. And if you could regroup, jobs and people close by, everybody could bicycle to work or even walk. You have solved an enormous problem. You lower your energy bill. You have short commuting time, more time for your family or your leisure or your education. You solve every problem. It's a wonderful model. It doesn't exist. Why? In spite of all the efforts and all the plan. Why? Well, because what we discussed about the labor market. When you go to a city, if you move to Auckland or to New York, you're not saying, well, I'm going to find a house, and the next thing, I'm going to look around for a job within 1 kilometer from my house because I don't want to walk more than that. If you move to New York, you are going to find a house where you can, more or less your salary. You are going to find a house where you can afford it. You will try to get something that attracts you, in this neighborhood. Maybe people will speak your language, or maybe there will be a tennis court next by, or maybe your mother-in-law, whatever. That will be your decision. And then you will look what is the distance to your work. Eventually, you will probably change job too. You are not going to, when you change job, going to change house at the same time. Probably not. So it's a city which has to adjust. No planners can match, jobs and people at the same time. So, by the way, a household is usually made of several people who work. So, if this scheme had to work, you will have one day to tell your partner, I'm going to change job, so we are going to change house, and you are also going to change job and house at the same time. You can imagine probably everybody will stay single after things like that. So these things do not exist, but again, you will see it all the time, in master plan. Now, it could be only funny, except that when those plans are, they cannot be implemented, but they require investment, and then a lot of effort and investment are going into it, and it's just a waste of resources, which are not used somewhere else. So it's more tragic than funny. I have here 2 metropolitan areas in which I've worked. One here is Seoul, in Korea, and this is Paris. This is the entire metropolitan area. Seoul, they are represented, by the way, at the same scale. So to give you a sense of the scale, from one side to another here, we have about 100 kilometers, across. It's a huge area. Paris, same scale, but Paris here, what is represented here is 11 million people live in this area, represented in, black. That's a built-up area. And here in Seoul, we have 25 million people living there, much higher density than Paris. Here, this is a huge labor market, and this is a huge labor market. I'm not saying that anybody who is living here at the extreme is necessarily looking seriously to a job at the other side. Probably not. But ideally, the city will work better if they could, by the way. So the trips are not necessarily, but the trips are really all across the metropolitan area, and this is the strength of Seoul. Now, what those two cities have in common is that 30 years ago, they decided, 30, this is my timer, I've passed my time. 30 years ago, they have decided that they were going to restrict the growth of the city and that they would encourage the growth of secondary town, outside even this area. And they both spent quite a bit of resource doing it. Both countries, they have a government, especially the central government, is rather authoritarian. That includes France also. Whether they are socialist or conservative in power, it's a centralized, based on a Napoleonic model of, very centralized. So I say that because it's a country where politically the government has the power to, much more power on the development of city than a city which is more on an Anglo-Saxon model, where the local authority has much more power. In spite of that, and by the way, we could say the same thing about Korea. But Korea is even, much more muscular than France for that, but they can enforce things. In spite of this enforcement power and this strong commitment to it, they were not able to do it. Again, the market, the economy designed the city, not that. The problem, of course, is that when you have that, you have, as a city grows, you have to provide a system of transport which corresponds to the actual trip, not the trip you want them to do, but the trip which are occurring. Because if a firm here in Korea is moving from the center to this part here, they have a good reason for it. And this reason, no planners could know it. They do not have the information. So they have to have confidence in the firm. If they have moved to this area, it means that it's necessary for them. If a household move also from one area to another, the planner have to have the confidence that they made the best decision. They cannot assume that they have enough information to say, no, you don't know what you are doing. We will put you in a housing estate somewhere here because it's better for you. And this is unfortunately sometimes what planners are doing. Let us look here at Seoul again. What happened in the last 20 years, in the last 10 years actually. Again here we have divided Seoul in circle from the center of the city, 0, up to 77 kilometers from the center. And we have counted over a period of 10 years, where did the jobs grew, where the new jobs were located, and where the new population which was added over those 10 years has located spatially. So in blue here we have the jobs, and in red we have the population. You see that in the center, in fact the center has lost population. Why did the center lose population? Because income in Korea has grown quite a bit. And when income were lower, people were consuming much less floor space. You will have a family of 3 living in probably 50, 60 square meters. As soon as they get more affluent, they are looking for better housing. And the better housing, cheaper housing would be probably cheaper. So that's why you had some losses. There was some job addition, but look where the bulk of the population has grown. It's between 20 kilometers from the city to 45. The bulk of the population have been there, and quite a bit of the new jobs too. That again is something that the planners had not foreseen, were trying to discourage. But it happened because the economy of Korea is precisely based on this pattern. It's based on the entrepreneur, it's based on the firm, and it's based on the household who are looking for a job and optimizing from their point of view, not necessarily shortening the distance, but optimizing their location. Again, this trade-off between the size of housing, what they can afford, other amenities that they will be interested in. For instance, in Korea, the quality of the school is extremely important in the choice of location. they are not going to move in a new area if they are not sure there is a good school, at least for, of course, the household who have children. Now, what is, so far I've been talking only about market and mostly about, government or planners misunderstanding market and doing their own thing. Well, it's not, it's a little caricatural. I think government in both Paris or Seoul or in many cities have played a very, very important role and very positive. But let us see what it is. What is the role of planning traditionally? Planning normally, planning come back a very, very, very many years, very long time. The goal of planning was to separate private use to public use. If you have a city, you need areas which are common to everybody, where you circulate from one part to another, one part of the state to another. So the idea of planning originally was to separate those two. Then, after that, you need also to separate, there are certain areas of the city that you want to keep open, as a park, for instance, if we are talking about Oakland, the volcanoes, for instance, you decide you don't want to build on the volcanoes. So you separate that become a public good that nobody can build. So you remove, in a way, the area which will not be on the market, and you separate them from the one who are on the market. Now, another goal of planning was to prevent externalities by separating incompatible use. In the old days, I think the nightmare of people was that a tannery will come next to their house. Tannery will be very smelly, and so that would be a typical externality. So you had laws which were relatively simple on, on this extent, the nuisance that some activity would create. So that's still completely legitimate, obviously. From there, I think planners have built up layers and layers of incompatibility which do not necessarily correspond to modern life. In the United States, for instance, a doctor, a physician, cannot locate in his office in a residential area at all. He has to go in a commercial area. It's not allowed. You have even a small shop and have to be completely separated from residential area. I think that here there is an exaggeration of the externality. Sometimes you have also division that are exaggerated. For instance, software firm is sometimes considered an industrial, although and they have to be located in a certain area. And of course, the problem with locating in a certain area that the amount of land which is available for them is decided in advance by the planner. You cannot go outside. I will give you an example. In New York, which is a relatively liberal city, and market-oriented city compared to many, the area around Greenwich Village was about 50 years ago occupied mostly still by sweatshops. They were it was a garment industry was there, and they were about 6-7 story building with well, they were garments, not really factories, but they were a garment industry. The owner of the garment industry moved out of this area for good reason. Wages were too high. They didn't need that much skilled labor. And then, of course, there was a traffic jam in being in the center of Manhattan. So they moved out. At the time, it was zone industrial. The city kept these blocks as industrial for many years. On one hand, there was the pressure of the union who thought that by keeping the land industrial, industry will come back. Again, if they moved out, they have a good reason for it. Industry didn't come back. Eventually, those buildings were abandoned for about, I would say, about 15 years, and with a big loss to the city, by the way, because they will start paying property tax. They were practically, nobody was paying really property tax because there was no, there was no business there. Eventually, artists start coming in, and in a way, illegally squatting in those empty buildings. And the city of New York at that time didn't want to kick out artists. It doesn't look well in the press if a painter, you expel a painter from an empty building. So they decided to rezone it for artists. Now, then came the definition, who is an artist? So, so you had the people took advantage of it, and they created an association where if you pay a fee, you will become an artist. But you will have to. I'm not kidding. You will have to prove that you were part of this association to be able legally, for instance, to connect to water or electricity. If not, you were there illegally. Eventually, the city decided that they would just zone it for residential and commercial, the normal zoning. It took more than 20 years, and it created, I'm sure, a lot of hardship, to a lot of people, not only artists. And so they are very slow, the planners are very, very slow to follow that. And again, where it's completely legitimate to try to separate functions which are, incompatible, I think that there is an extension here of the definition which goes far. This is a plan which was created in the 6th century BC. It was a Greek city, but now in Turkey, by a guy called Miletus, first planner probably. It's also the city where Thales was born, a mathematician. And you see here, what they did was simple. They did a grid, and they started with the north here, and then when the city expanded, they expanded to the south, slightly changing. They kept land for public facility, for instance, the Agora, for the tribunal, some of the government facility, they took it away from the thing. The rest was entirely on the market. They never say, this is commercial, this is residential, thing like that. The advantage of this approach is that the city could invest. Investors could go there and invest in all security. They knew what was government land. They knew the width of street. They knew, so they could in advance, locate where they were. And now, when you do excavation, you realize that what happened was what would happen in a city nowadays. The area next to the port are mostly commercial, and small artisan and manufacturing. And when you go further from the port, it's become residential. Those laws have not changed. However, from this very simple model, which by the way was still used, when Washington DC was created by L'Enfant, it was basically also a separation between the space for street and the private space. Although people always think of Washington as a planned city, it is not a planned city. It is a city where the roads were traced in advance. And then some lot was reserved for the government, like the White House or the Capitol. But basically, the rest, L'Enfant never say, K Street will be for lobbyists, and and Georgetown for politicians or something like that. They never did that. The market did that later and changed it completely. There is, however, what I call mission creep for in cities. That in planning. The planners think that they can use their power of zoning to redistribute, let's say, to reorganize a city again the way an architect organized a building. You have the master bedroom, you have the children's bedroom, you have the kitchen, you have the bathroom, an architect does that. Planners very often try to do that, and then they take on what I would call social engineering, not only separating roads and things, but social engineering. For instance, the latest thing I think, I was flabbergasted when I saw that there are planners who are saying our plan, part of our objective is to reduce obesity. And they feel that people who live in suburbs, for some reason, take less exercise, which I don't quite believe it's true, but they said so. And that, therefore, they will prevent the growth of suburbs, or they will force higher density in suburbs in order to reduce obesity in the population. So while reducing obesity is, of course, a very worthwhile thing, I don't think planning is the role of planners. This is social engineering, and we have to stay away from it. And other things, like reducing carbon emission, for instance. If you are serious, if you really want to reduce carbon emission, you just price carbon. That's the only way to do it. But to change the width of street or to to design a zoning which will reduce carbon is a myth. It will never work in the first place, and it will impose an enormous cost on people. Now, after that, very often, this is the latest fad. You know, when I start working in planning, the fad we had was functional. We use the word functional everything. And basically, functional was what I was doing, and what you were doing was not functional. So that was a, you could always argue that something is functional. It all depends what depends. Now, nobody talks about functional, but you hear about smart growth, sustainable city, livable city. Now, everybody likes to be smart, sustainable, well, if it means that the city is going to fail within 5 years, yes, obviously everybody wants to be sustainable. The problem with sustainable and livable cities is that there are no quantifiable objectives to it. It's just a good housekeeping name that you put on yourself. You know, if there is something even, I would say, Orwellian about it. You know, in George Orwell novel, there was a Ministry of Truth. You know, will you trust a Ministry of Truth? Or will you trust a newspaper called Pravda, you know, the truth also? Will you consider democratic a country like the North Korea, would call itself a People's Democratic Republic? And I think that sustainable city and livable city is a bit like that. It's a label that they put on themselves, not measurable, not quantifiable, and then they can get away with it. What I would like is that they replace this thing with some quantifiable objective, saying, right now in our city, the average commuting time is 45 minutes. We are going to improve transport and traffic management so it comes down to 30 minutes. Housing represents the median housing, you know, cost 8 times the average, the median income. We are going to work out so it comes down to 6 in the next 5 years or 10 years. And the means to do that would be different. It could be an improvement in transport, it could be traffic management, it could be new roads, new infrastructure, but it could be other things too. You know, it could be it could be changing some regulation. It could be accelerating building permit. You know, sometimes a building permit, or you know, between the moment a developer wants to build something and the moment where the house is delivered on the market, it can take 5 or 6 or 7 years. This has an enormous cost. You know, interest has enormous cost. If you could reduce that, you will reduce the price of housing. So most probably, if they had target like that, forget about sustainable or smart goals, just a target. Give us a target and try to find a mean. Now, not everything will work out. For instance, they may say, well, we are going, for instance, to allow a much taller building in the city. And indeed, that could increase the supply of housing, but maybe not quite enough to reduce its prices. Because every time you replace an existing building by a taller one, you have again a very high transaction cost, and it's relatively slow. In the long run, I think it's desirable that the intensity of use of a piece of land reflects its price, therefore, but maybe that's not the best way to increase the supply of housing in the short run. You know, it's only a very small of it. So there are many ways of doing it, but unless you have indicators, you cannot achieve it. You know, some cities. Here I have a graph on American cities. During the last since 1975, so that's what 40 years. At the top graph here is showing the it's an index. It starts in 1975 at 100, and every city follow a different curve. These are the ones who have increased in price the most. The 20 cities which saw in those 40 years the most price increase. And you see that, by the way, the price increase was not a straight curve. It depended again on the economy. So you see that some cities, and I didn't put the name here, but The top one was, I think, if I remember, was San Francisco, Boston, New York, were the top one here. Some city increased enormously, and then you have other cities here which were practically flat. Now, some of those flat cities, flat housing price cities, were not very successful economically. Among them you will have Detroit. You will have some city of the Middle West like St. Louis or something where had difficulty adjusting to the modern economy. But quite a number of them here are very successful. Like, for instance, Houston or Dallas are quite successful, actually, one of the most successful. And the prices didn't increase. So you see, it has management of the city and the management of the supply of land has a lot to do with that. You are not bound to a... Now, again here, if I compare Houston to Oakland, it's clear that it's much easier to expand the supply of land in Houston than it is in Oakland, and certainly in Wellington, when you look at the topography. So I would expect probably Wellington not to have a flat profile like that, but a probably lesser steep profile than it has now if the problem was really faced. So basically, I think that planners should concentrate on two issues. Maintaining mobility, that means making sure that from one side of the city to another, you could go in less than 1 hour, whatever it takes, whether it's, again, new roads, changing vehicle law, encouraging smaller vehicle, developing transit, telepheric, I don't know what it could be, but the goal is to do that and achieve that. The other is affordability. I think that if the price of housing goes up very fast, the planners have a responsibility for it, and they should be, they should take it into account. The University of Wisconsin, the real estate department, which is one of the best in the US, which intrigued me because it's in Madison, it's not a particularly large city, but they have the best real estate for some reason. And they have developed 9 indicators to monitor the housing sector. I think that those indicators, you will find them in, probably the real estate association, in each city will have those indicators and monitor them. Probably the bank giving mortgage will do that too. I think that those indicators should be monitored in the planning department because that's their responsibility, because they can act on it. You see, if those indicators are monitored by the real estate association, of course it's very important for them because they know the trend, but they have very little leverage on modifying those indicators. It's just a projection of what the business will be in the future. Where in the planning department, they have a direct responsibility for this. In particular, one indicator is infrastructure expenditure ratio. You take the infrastructure expenditure per capita and also in absolute capital every year, and you see how it evolves. And I think this is very important. And the responsibility for spending on infrastructure is with the city management. It is not with the realtors. The realtors, of course, it's important for them, but so that's where when we're talking about monitoring mobility, it's a little more difficult. But I will show you an example here in Singapore here. They have monitoring mobility. They are monitoring mobility, and they divide it for cars, people who use car, buses, and MRT, the subway. Now, the people using MRT here are usually using a feeder bus and then the subway. They don't use purely the subway. They use the bus. So what they did is measure the travel time for commuting. By the way, very important for mobility to separate commuting for other things. If you go and buy groceries or your kid go to school, that should not be amalgamated into mobility because it will distort the thing. So you have to count commuting. Commuting, you're obliged to do it. Here they managed to improve, you see, the lighter color here is 97, then 2004, and then the darker blue is 2008. They have managed to decrease the trip by car from 30 minutes to 25 minutes, over a period of 25, 20 years. So they are monitoring it. It doesn't seem like a big decrease. It is a big decrease. It is important. It is improving there. Now, for people taking the bus, it has been flat. They have not been able to improve that. One of the reasons is that I think a number of people who were using the bus at a certain time shifted to the MRT. Now, the metro, look at the difference now. The metro, the time has gone down also from 57 minutes to 52, which is a good achievement, and at least they are monitoring it. But look at the difference between the time spent commuting if you take public transit and cars. And by the way, this is true all over the world, this huge difference in transit. For about the same distance, they monitor also distance is about the same distance. Now, the obvious thing would be to say, well, why don't everybody move to cars, and then that will, they will commute in a short time. The problem is that those people can commute in 25 minutes precisely because 50% of the population is using the transit. If everybody was using the car with the layout of Singapore, it will probably not work. So you have to have a balancing here. There is no doubt that people who are taking the MRT are heavily penalized compared to the one taking the car. The only, let's say, the justification in Singapore is that the people taking the car are paying such a high price. The right to own a car is auctioned every year, and the current price for owning a car, not for buying a car, for owning a car, is $80,000. And then you have to buy the car after that, and then you have to pay tolls when you enter the car in a. So that's a way. That's a way, in a way, they manage that. Some people are saying that on their policy, in a way, they have loaded the price of a car, and so in order to make the trip by car very fast, but at the expense of the other. That if the speed within have been high, lower, then more people would have been able to afford a car. I mean, that you can, again, I will never argue on the policy itself. What I like about Singapore is a consistency in their policy, and that they are monitoring things and they are doing things about it. This is the same data for US. You see again the ratio between trip by car and transit is nearly the same. This is my last slide. Mobility indicators are much more difficult to do. I found this thing very interesting. It's a recent work which has been done in Buenos Aires. You have a map of Buenos Aires, which is on a computer, and they have put all the jobs and all the transport system on the same map. So you can click on any point in the city, and you also decide, in the you have a quadrant where you decide how long the commuting time would take. So in this case, I have taken 60 minutes, and I have selected in the suburb a point here which represented in red, and it shows how many jobs, if you have a car, you can reach in 1 hour. I get 5 million jobs, and I have the map here of all the jobs you can reach in 1 hour if you have a car, if you start at rush hour from this point. You do the same thing with transit, same point, and 1 hour, you access only 700,000 jobs. Now, this again is not an indictment of transit for especially a city like Buenos Aires, which is rather dense and have a very strong center too. It's an indictment of the management of the company, of the transport system. They should bring some Singaporean to improve their improvements. So one of the indicator the planners should have here, say, all right, in this point, you get 700,000 jobs. We want you to take some measure, maybe investment, maybe just purely management, so that you reach 1.5 million jobs from the same point. That's the way the economy will grow. That will be the performance. Thank you very much. This is just that's a map of densities on Oakland. So of course, you see within those circles, there is so much water in it that it's not so much of a surprise that land will be expensive. You have to compensate this topography by more investment in infrastructure to reach more land, further away and keep it there. This is we don't see here I've superimposed Stockholm and and Auckland, the same density profile. So Stockholm is in light gray here. It's a little too light. You see that the two cities have the same population and not quite the same constraint, but nearly the same constraint in terms of water. And Stockholm has much denser center, but when it goes to the periphery, it's very similar to Auckland, with a little bump at the end here. These were the latest public housing that the government built at the very end of the metro or railway system. Thank you very much.